reviewing the scientific literature to answer your questions about gender diversity. This is Classroom Psychology. And now here's your host, Dr. Cora Sargent. Hello everybody and welcome to Classroom Psychology. I'm your host Cora. Thank you so very, very much for joining me. It is wonderful to see you. I'm hoping you're doing very, very well. You're super welcome here. Let's talk about gender diversity. And this week, much like we do every time we come together, we take a confidently declared statement from a public figure or a politician or sometimes a famous book author. In this case, we take it from an author and a YouTube host, Jay Phantom. Now, in the last few weeks, you might have, if you've been plugged into the social commentary around the Paris Olympics, you might have heard of Imane Khalif. Now, Imane is a female Algerian boxer, been kicking ass in women's boxing and won gold this year. Congratulations to Imane, and she's an outstanding athlete. But the reason you might have heard of her is because of the social commentary around her participation, with people claiming that she is not a woman at all, with not really any base in reality. But that isn't the point. The point is that this is another person who's caught around the increasingly dramatically kind of discriminatory social commentary around the transgender community, gender diverse communities, and now cisgender communities who just don't look feminine enough on the basis of nothing really other than vibes. So we have, you could tell I'm a little bit riled by this one, because when we talk about the ways in which we talk about people online, it can seem quite benign that somebody with a very large following can claim that somebody isn't a member of a community that they are, right? And when they do that to their extremely large following, it can seem like a fairly nasty but otherwise reasonably benign act. But when we look at the literature, we can find that it's not benign at all. And the outcomes of this kind of harassment are actually really, really problematic. So to bring all of this into, to crystallize it in our minds, we have the author and host of the YouTube series, The Story Box, Jay Phantom.
Nowadays, it would seem that you can be sued for harassment and cyberbullying for speaking the actual truth. Yes, I'm talking about the biological male that we actually know because it's a written fact. There was 2 tests that were done by the IBA. And anyway, Imane Khalif is deciding to sue, literally actually suing the likes of people that said the truth over on social media that Imane Khalif is a biological male. Unbelievable. Some of those people that have been named, Riley Gaines, J.K. Rowling, Elon Musk, and Donald Trump. So it would seem that some of the people that have a great deal of money, influence, and are on the side of reason, rationale, and sanity are the ones being attacked. Now, what's interesting about this lawsuit is that it's a French prosecutor, and apparently this French prosecutor can also go after international figures. That's why they're going to go after J.K. Rowling, Elon Musk, and Donald Trump, of all people, Riley Gaines. There were several others that their names weren't mentioned, but they've been said. Look, if you're going to go after everybody that made a statement about Imane Khalif being a male, you'd be in the courts for literally years, because there were so many people that made comments, made videos, made statements. They were talking about this. It was a huge controversy, but for some reason, they're going after the big fish, the ones that actually have a great deal of influence and a lot of money, as it would seem.
Thanks so very much to Jay Phantom for such an interesting question posed, as they often are in the form of confident declaration. But we're going to take it for the question that I know it was intended to be. And listen, I'm not going to focus on Imane, and I'm my deepest apologies to Imane. I can only imagine. In fact, I really can't imagine what it must be like to be on the receiving end of people talking about your most intimate details in such just so flagrantly, so openly, and in so many different spaces. And so here, my deepest apologies for, again, bringing forward a voice essentially doing that same thing. We, however, are not going to do that. We're not going to talk about Imane anymore. Instead, what we're going to talk about is cyberbullying and harassment and the outcomes of that. Because as much as what has been happening has been to question whether Imane should box against other women, what is often the most frequent defense I see is that Imane is a woman, is that Imane is not trans. And that's a very reasonable defense, with the exception that transgender women are also women, everyone. So I don't think that's as helpful a defense as it seems. And I wish Imane all the very best as she takes these folk to court for what she describes as cyberbullying. And for sure, I would say that this is an example of cyberbullying, digital harassment. And so what we're going to do is take a look at the evidence for digital harassment and cyberbullying. What are the outcomes of that? Like, what is it? Why is what's happening here around poor Imane, who's a freaking badass, by the way, what's happening around her is so problematic, not only for her, but for all of us, and what it means for all of us to watch this take place, and for all of us to then live in a world where cyberbullying and harassment just seems a little bit more commonplace. And we're going to end on the question of what we can do instead, how the internet can be a place of belonging and growth and community, and how we can make a world where everyone can find a place to belong. But let's take a look at literature. Let's go. Come on. Let's go. Cyberbullying and harassment. What the hell is it? Is this it? And what does that mean? Okay. Whoa. Let's pump the brakes. We need to pump the brakes, everyone. Apologies. I was looking at the definitions of cyberbullying. Alweus is our best place to go for that definition, because Alweus' definition of bullying is possibly the most cited I've seen. Certainly it's one of the most popular I have seen, and it's a very clear definition. They describe any action deliberately causing or attempting to cause harm repeatedly where there is an imbalance of power that makes it hard for the victim to defend themselves. Now, usually that's, that imbalance of power is because of social standing or social status or popularity. When we're talking about online cyberbullying, of course, there's often an imbalance of power on the basis of popularity, on followership, on the number of people that you can talk to when you speak, right? So when, for example, J.K. Rowling posts about Imane, she's posting to 14 million people, where when, somebody like me posts on X, I'm posting to like a few hundred at most, right? So the difference in power is absolutely staggering in that regard. Now, the reason I need to pump the brakes, I know you were like, pumping the brakes. Whoa, where'd that come from? Yeah, forgive me. This is a bit weird. I know this is a bit weird what I'm doing here in pumping the brakes, but it needs to happen because I'm going through something kind of live. So what's really interesting, there's a couple of really interesting studies, one of them by Powell and colleagues. They talk about cyberbullying. They grab people from Canada and the UK, 30 men, 30 women, 30 transgender adults, and they talk about the number of people who have experienced some kind of cyberbullying or harassment. And they found they created some really interesting definitions. So they said that 63.3% of transgender participants, only 30 transgender participants in the study, but they had like thousands of participants overall. It's just there's not that many transgender people, generally speaking. They found, though, that 63.3% of transgender people were more likely to experience, they're more likely to report experiencing somebody threatening to physically harm them, someone harassing them for a sustained period, and someone sharing embarrassing details about them than were other participants in the study. For generally female participants, it was about 10% about physical harm, the threat for physical harm, 13.3% for sustained harassment, and 23.3% about someone sharing embarrassing details. And for male participants, it's 23.3% about the threats to physical harm, 13.3% around someone harassing them, and 20% experiencing someone sharing embarrassing details about them. For the trans population, again, 63.3% for all of them. So the trans population just generally more likely to experience those things. They also found that transgender participants were more likely to experience people posting offensive messages about their gender online, 60%, people posting offensive and or degrading messages about their sexuality, 63%, and someone describing or visually representing an unwanted sexual act against their avatar or game character, that's 33%, which is obviously horrendous. And polyvictimization is obviously very frequent in the transgender community, 40% once again. Now, the reason we need to pump the brakes is because I was like, oh yeah, I've experienced some of this stuff, particularly the sort of offensive messages online. And I was like, you know what would be quite cool for the podcast is to just have a look at some of the comments that I received, just to kind of contextualize it, right? And I found that Mumsnet had found me again in a way that I didn't realize they had found me. So I have experienced in the last year 3 kind of instances of kind of pylons online, twice from Mumsnet and once from X. And this one from Mumsnet is not one I had seen before. And I wanted to pump the brakes so that I could say, you know, live, this is kind of what the experience is like. You know, I'm old, you know, I'm 41 years of age. Maybe that's not that old, but I'm 41. I've been around the sun a few times, and I have experienced a lot of this kind of stuff, but it doesn't seem to make it any easier. Some of the things that they say are a very difficult read. They talk about things that I've said at Viva to candidates, which is, you know, wild to me that they would know that, let alone that was what they would talk about. They talk about how I absolutely should not be doing my job, that I'm doing a great deal of harm, and they accuse me of stuff that I literally can't say on the podcast because it's too awful to repeat. And some of the comments that they have made are have been deleted because they're so extreme about me. Deleted by the system, by Mumsnet headquarters, because they breached the talk guidelines. I really genuinely, like, you know, it has happened a few times. It's happened a few times. The first time was in response to a podcast episode I appeared on, the MS Trust podcast, and they came and found me because of that and misrepresented a story I told, and accused me of the most horrendous things. And then on X, they came for me again after I was on the podcast What the Trans, but this one is in response to the Gender Euphoria episode that I created at the beginning of this year, episode 19 on gender euphoria, which is just research about trans joy, right? That's all it is just research on young people and adults experiencing the joy of being themselves in the world. And, you know, they describe they describe the most horrendous stuff. I wasn't expecting to feel this way during this episode. And I can't describe to you adequately the experience other than to say that I could hear my blood pumping in my ears. My adrenaline was just soaring, And just as I was reading this stuff, it was extraordinary, the experience. And bearing in mind, that's like 50, 60 odd comments in a thread on Mumsnet. That's not everybody on X talking about me. And I really, really feel for Imane and for all of the people online who receive this regularly because they're in the public eye so much. Dylan Mulvaney absolutely comes to mind. I can absolutely understand how awful this experience is for people. And my heart absolutely goes out to all of those people who are experiencing harassment or victimization online, or who experience poly-victimization, or it happens repeatedly and sustained over time. I absolutely feel for those people. I'll be right back. I'm going to take a break. Take a break. I will be right back. All right, I took a break. Let's go get them. So far, we talked about the challenge of cyberbullying, that it occurs in relationships where there's an imbalance of power. And when we're talking about online, that generally happens because of follower differences, right? Some people, they have literally louder voices that can reach more people. And when we're talking about more people, when we talk about physical bullying in school, for example, we're often talking about a person or a group of people enacting the bullying, a lot of bystanders, in the tens, maybe, single digits or tens. Hundreds would be potential, but unlikely. Thousands, not a chance. And here we have a situation where there are millions of bystanders. And of course, it's in a relationship where there's a dramatic, staggering imbalance of power online, where that's not necessarily the case in person. And also online, it can be the case where anonymity is offered to the bully in a way that is not often the case in person, right? It's very difficult to stay anonymous unless you wear a mask or something, right? It's very difficult to stay anonymous in person, but online, much more easy to stay anonymous. So you're either anonymous or potentially you have this staggering amount of power. So if you are, let's say, making fun of a transgender person's appearance, for example, and you have somewhere in the region of about 14 million followers, many of whom follow you because they agree with what you do, then you have a sort of an audience of 14 million people who, many of whom kind of agree with the things that you're saying. And then the victim, who often is plucked out of complete obscurity online, who might have hundreds or thousands of followers, but certainly don't have the millions that the person making the comment does. It might mean very much that there is a very staggering imbalance of power between the bully and the victim. Now, we also found that transgender people are more likely to experience it. Yes, that study that we highlighted was probably one of the most recent. It's a good piece of work, but there's also a systematic review from a Bro and Kenny in 2018, and they found that of LGBTQ youth, cyberbullying is experienced by those youth in the range of between 10.5% and 71.3%, depending on the study. That's obviously a great deal of heterogeneity across the studies, but it clearly demonstrates that LGBTQ youth have a quite high incidence of experiencing cyberbullying, which is really important. We're going to come back to that study. Also, Ballard and Welch in 2017 highlight that this is particularly challenging for people at intersections of multiple marginalized identities. They are at increased risk, and they experience cyberbullying and cyber victimization more severely for people at the intersection of multiple marginalized identities. So, and again, that's not going to be super surprising, I would think. Now, cyberbullying and cyber victimization on social media, including X, I think has a potentially exaggerated effect in terms of the theory of cyberbullying as applied here, because in bullying literature, one of the most effective interventions is to recruit bystanders, right? If you are in a playground and you see a bullying incident take place, often the research highlights that bystanders don't agree with the bullying, but they often don't feel compelled to intervene. But if they did intervene, then we would find that more bystanders would intervene, and their ability to turn the tide of public opinion, to protect against the bullying taking place, to provide support and to challenge what's happening is actually quite strong. But when we're talking about social media, their power is much less strong. If we take a look at, like, let's say that, you know, you say something about a transgender person's appearance to your 14 million followers, you then have 14 million bystanders effectively, right? And because of the way in which social media, we already mentioned, of course, those 14 million follow you for a reason, right? They follow you not because they hate what you say or think or disagree with it necessarily. A lot of them are going to follow because they agree, and therefore the bystanders are not necessarily going to experience the sort of the neutrality or the disapproval that a lot of bystanders in person are going to, because the bystanders in person aren't bystanding because they follow the person who's bullying. They bystand because they happen to be there when the bullying is taking place. Now, gotta bear in mind that that's like, you know, just 14 million followers is staggering and hard to imagine, but it's a bit like a playground where someone with a lot of social power just makes fun of a transgender person's appearance in front of the population of Tokyo, right? Like, that's the number of people around the population of Tokyo. But of course, the nature of in-person bullying means that a single bystander standing up and saying something is heard by everyone, right? If you stand up and say something, you are heard by the people around you. So this is what I say. If you are a bystander in a bullying situation, you have a great deal of power, because when you speak, people can hear you. The problem with Twitter, the problem with X, the problem with other social media platforms where this takes place is that when somebody, even if they are a follower of the person doing the act, even if they are a follower, if they say something in response that is negative, in part because of the way in which the algorithm sort of promotes engagement on the app, and the way in which, you know, the dissenting voices get muted as a consequence, but also like more reasonable voices get muted as a consequence. But also, even if you are a follower of somebody who's a big name in there and you hear them say something, if you say, hey, stop, you're heard by only your followers, not by theirs, right? You'll feature on this long list of replies, but you won't feature as a person who gets promoted to the 14 million people, right? In the same way. So your power to intervene is also really heavily reduced. Even if you do disagree with the bullying and don't participate and want to challenge it, it's very, very difficult to do so, even as a bystander. So not only does the victim in these circumstances, also because of their kind of often plucked from obscurity status, they don't, generally speaking, have a great following to be able to challenge what's happening. You also then have bystanders also unable to challenge what's happening. So this heavy echo chamber effect of people being able to support an act which is harmful in a space like that, you know, it's very hard unless you have a lot of people disagreeing. It's very difficult to actually influence any change. Now, that's a really big problem in and of itself, right? But also, then there's the lack of accountability on the apps themselves, because, you know, X tends not to intervene when somebody says something very unkind about the transgender population. In fact, it seems like they don't really get intervened with at all. And it's only when people take people to court outside of the app that people get stopped. Now, of course, X has its own terms of service and will prevent people from acting outside of them. But we can see that, you know, very popular people on X and other platforms say some pretty bold things, including about Imane, that were not true, that ended up just still being on X. They haven't been taken down. They haven't been challenged anywhere. And so we see that these folk are speaking without accountability. And that plays into the fears that victims are going to be blamed, that bullies aren't held to account, that bullies are empowered, and that victims are disempowered. And what happens, of course, in that circumstance, what could easily happen is that victims are not going to come forward in other circumstances in quite the same way, right? Because they are not going to be heard, or they're not going to be believed, or even if they are, and everybody can see that somebody is saying a thing that is untrue and harmful, still no accountability taking place. It's very difficult in those circumstances for marginalized communities to feel like anybody is on their side. Now, in that context, the effects on victims are actually quite staggering. There's a very cool piece of work by McPherson in 2022, The Psychological Evidence of Cyberbullying Among Transgender Adults. This is of transgender adults. It's a dissertation, which is really cool when we're talking about qual research, because this dissertations feature a lot more direct quotations, generally speaking. So you can look at their experience directly from their words. 14 adults participated in the study, 7 male to female transgender folk, 4 female to male transgender folk, and 3 non-binary individuals, all of 22 to 55 years of age. And here are some quotes of their experiences of cyberbullying. So before I came out to everybody, I had 2 social media accounts, 2 Facebook accounts. One is my female and one is my male account that I'd not come out to yet. I ended up having to delete the female account just because it would get so much harassment. So after that, another participant, I had to shut down the TikTok account as well because I couldn't keep up with the trolls. I'm like, oh, if I get trolls, I'll just report and delete them, Report and delete, it'll be fine. But there were so many, I couldn't physically do it. I had to shut it all off, abandoned it for a good couple of days, and when I came back, it had all calmed down. They were talking about how they like to scare women, how they take pleasure in making women feel scared, and even had no regret if they were to hit a woman. They wouldn't care. And then they finalized it by saying girls like me are just a fetish. Guys want to be with biological women and don't want to be seen with girls like us in the streets. We're just a fetish. And they talk about the effects. It makes them feel horrible. It's kind of almost in a way making you doubt yourself on levels that you're never going to be good enough. You're never going to pass enough. You're never going to be a woman. You're never going to be a man. You invalidate yourself so much that your power is stripped away. At first, I had a breakdown, your initial response. And I think that's fair for anyone who's having that come at them. You're probably not going to react in your exact right state of mind. It's coming at you from every direction, and even if it's only coming at you from one direction, it's awful enough. I think it made me just severely shut down and fueled a lot of my reclusive behaviors. And it also makes it difficult to advocate for myself publicly. If I get ma'amed or called Mrs., it's really hard for me to feel validated enough to correct them, Like if you get told something enough times, you internalize it to a degree. Whether you actually think it's true or not, it will affect your behavior, and that will in turn affect how you're treated. It made me more timid in a way that I wasn't used to and that I'm still not used to. It's always amazing to hear from people's lived experience directly. There's nothing quite like it. And I find it quite comforting in a strange way to know that other people who have experienced it too have similar experiences. That comment that the participant made about not reacting like your right self. For sure, I experienced that. I felt very much not like myself for a little bit. Deepest apologies, I found myself again. So let's continue. And as we continue, we're going to go to a really important piece of work. This is by Abro and Kenny in 2017. Cyberbullying LGBTQ Youth, a systematic literature review and recommendations for prevention and intervention. So their systematic review yielded 27 different studies, all of which looked at LGBTQ cyberbullying. Fascinating stuff. Thank goodness. I do love a good systematic review, not least because it allows us to get a good sense of the scientific consensus in the whole field. And it means that you and I don't need to go study by study together because, goodness, I think you might get bored of that. These studies, though, 19 of them were in the United States, 3 in Canada, 3 in Australia, 1 in Sweden, 1 in the UK. Most of them were kind of national samples, and the sample size ranged for all the studies between 18, that was Vargas, their study is a small qualitative study, always really useful, and 20,406 participants in the largest study, and the rest were a mix somewhere across them. Most of the studies had age range of 11 to 25 years of age. Most of the studies conducted with secondary school students, and quite a diverse sample. I mean, white participants definitely made up the largest range across studies, from 3.3% to 92%, then by Hispanics and Latinx, then African American and Black participants, Asian and Pacific Islander participants, biracial, multiracial, and other. They also included Native American or Indigenous folk. So they did have a range, though obviously it's quite white dominant, depending on the study, from 3.3% to 92% white. The studies included a range of genders and ethnicities, which I thought was really helpful. Fascinatingly, one study had 20% genderqueer participants, which is really helpful. That's Sturzing's. Then a lot of studies actually didn't report transgender participants, which is, not super helpful when it comes to this kind of work. But bearing in mind, a lot of studies are mostly focused on LGBT experiences, not including necessarily the T. But 11 studies did include transgender participants and had a range of between 0.25 and 15.2% transgender participants. Of course, we're going to have a range as well of more marginalized gender identities. I don't know, they didn't even talk about non-binary identities, but no doubt some studies did include them. They just don't reference them directly here. So a fascinating piece of work, right? What did they find? Well, they found some interesting stuff. The first thing they found is that most people don't tell anyone about experiencing cyberbullying. Super fascinating. They found that heterosexual participants are quite unlikely to report cyberbullying, even to a parental figure. 37% reported it, but for LGBT folk, the number was only 18%. The number one reason that they don't report cyberbullying is because they think that parents would restrict their use of technologies. They're also concerned that they're going to out themselves to people by revealing it. They're also concerned that parents can't do anything about the incidents of cyberbullying, that they're not going to understand it, they're going to not get support, or they're going to get into trouble, or worrying that by revealing the cyberbullying, they may provoke a reaction like further retaliation by the bully and a fear of being made fun of by other people. Generally speaking, I think in the wider bullying literature, one of the main reasons that people don't report bullying is because of the fear that it will make it worse. And it seems in cyberbullying, for sure, that is also the case here, and for LGBTQ participants particularly. So we talked about the high rate of bullying, cyberbullying, that these LGBT folk experience, and now we've talked about the very poor, low rate of actually telling a parental figure. That's reflected in telling school staff. People don't tell anyone because they're concerned that staff at school will blame them for the incident. They're concerned that staff at school won't handle the issue or will downplay the incident, or they feel just generally powerless, shameful, and fearful. And that, that means that they probably won't tell anyone either at home or at school. And the problem, therefore, is that they are on their own pretty much in managing the emotional consequences of bullying. And the emotional consequences of any kind of bullying are very, very severe. There aren't many things in the world that can have a deleterious effect on learning, but bullying is for sure one of them. So let's take a look at some of the outcomes of cyberbullying here. Trigger warning in advance, content warning. We are going to talk about some pretty tricky stuff, including mental health and including suicide. Forgive me in advance for that. Just a warning, probably for the next 5 or 10 minutes, we're going to be talking about that. Let's take a look. So a bunch of studies in the review all looked at the relationship between suicidal ideation, suicidal attempts, and cyberbullying. They often found that cyberbullying is also accompanied by traditional bullying too. So sometimes it's quite difficult to isolate cyberbullying. But for those that did, Cooper and Blumenfield, for example, found that 35% of LGBT participants reported having suicidal thoughts, while 14% reported attempting suicide as a result of being cyberbullied. Lots of people, like in Sinclair's study, reporting the need for medical attention after quite serious suicide attempts. Dong and Bradshaw talking about attempted suicide in the last 12 months for LGBT participants was 3 times higher after being cyberbullied than those who had not been cyberbullied. And Sena and colleagues found that cyberbullying, people who were cyberbullied reported higher rates of suicidal ideation than those who had not been cyberbullied, 55% versus 24%, just double the rate of suicidal ideation for LGBT participants who had been cyberbullied. Schneider and colleagues find that suicide attempts is highest, the rate of suicide attempts is highest among people who have been cyberbullied, though again, like versus those who had experienced face-to-face school bullying. So they found that suicide attempt rate was 4.2% for people who had experienced face-to-face in-person bullying, and 9.4% for people who had experienced cyberbullying, which is on itself like really important. Not only do we find that LGBT participants who experience cyberbullying are at an increased risk compared to those who don't experience cyberbullying, but they are at an increased risk compared to those who experience other forms of bullying, quite considerably increased risk, at least from Schneider's study. And Sena and colleagues found that bisexual and questioning girls and bisexual boys were also more likely to report suicidal ideation than heterosexual boys, with bisexual girls reporting higher levels than any other sexual minority youth. So again, cyberbullying isn't experienced sort of universally in the same way by everyone. And I think Sena's studies basically highlight that people at most marginalized positions in their marginalized identity, like bisexual girls, for example. But also, I would imagine that relates to like non-binary youth. And as we've already seen, people experiencing multiple marginalized identities are probably at greater risk from cyberbullying. Interestingly and quite harrowingly, experiencing multiple forms of bullying, which I guess here is probably similar to polyvictimization, right? In the bullying literature, experiencing victimization in more than one form, experiencing bullying in more than one form communicates a much increased risk. So we have multiple studies basically finding that people who experience cyberbullying as well as face-to-face bullying have a far increased risk to their mental health, specifically to their suicide risk. People experiencing far greater suicide attempts. So, for example, Dong and Bradshaw found that compared to people who didn't report any form of bullying, the risk of attempted suicide was 4.72 times greater for LGBT youth who had experienced a form of victimization, but 8.3 times greater for those who experienced 2 or more forms of victimization. Again, similar findings by Schneider and colleagues, who found that the highest percentage of suicide among those reported were among those who reported both face-to-face and cyberbullying combined. This is a really important piece of work. I'm so glad that we found it, so glad that it exists. I encourage you to go read it. It's Abro and colleagues, in fact, Abro and Kenny, 2017, Cyberbullying and LGBT Youth, the Systematic Literature Review. Go check it out. It's a really, really important piece of work. But onward, let's continue. So Systematic Review also found that people who experience cyberbullying, LGBT youth who experience cyberbullying, had significantly weaker academic performance, significantly lower academic performance, receiving failing academic grades and lower school attachment than people who had not experienced cyberbullying. And there are other behavioral and emotional consequences of cyberbullying. People who experience cyberbullying are, like LGBT youth who experience cyberbullying, are more likely to engage in physical fights. They're more likely to be to face harsher consequences than the perpetrators when they do. And They also experience poorer body image. This is from Cooper and Blumenfield's work. Poorer body image. They isolate themselves from friends and family, and they have a greater fear of going to school. So there are countless quite significant mental health consequences, behavioral consequences, academic consequences, and ultimately consequences for people hurting themselves. But the systematic review also took a look at ways in which we could help, which is so incredibly important. But they found this. Ramsey and colleagues in 2016 said, few interventions exist that are specifically developed to decrease cyberbullying, and no intervention of this kind exists for sexual minority populations in particular. So here is an opportunity for us. We can create interventions designed to tackle cyberbullying where we see it. So what can we do? Well, the authors were able to bring together 11 studies that looked at intervention and experiences of intervention for schools, students, and parents designed to tackle cyberbullying. And they found some interesting stuff in here, you guys. Super interesting. So Blumenfield and Cora and Cooper and Ramsey recommended raising awareness among students about the effects of LGBTQ cyberbullying. Now, the reason that psychoeducation programs are designed to be quite effective here is that cyberbullying, much like other bullying, can be quite effectively challenged through peer intervention, bystander intervention. So when somebody sees it happen online, stepping in and doing something to prevent it in smaller groups is much more effective. Now, peer-led approaches are also found to be quite effective by Palladino and colleagues. There's an important approach called No Trap with an exclamation mark, which is designed not for LGBTQ students specifically, but it is for cyberbullying specifically among high school students in the US. And now Palladino found that it had long-term effects, reducing cyberbullying for both boys and girls. Now, the fundaments of this is that it is a peer-led approach. So it puts students in charge of gathering the information about cyberbullying, understanding it, and then delivering training, teaching to other students to get buy-in, increase awareness, and otherwise reduce the instances of cyberbullying. So not only does it's kind of awareness raising and psychoeducation to try to not only help people who are bystanders step in and become people who can intervene, but also to help people who would otherwise be cyberbullies understand the impact of their potential actions and reduce the opportunities to do it by teaching them about the impacts. And again, peer-led approaches are really important, I guess, because it's very easy for adults to step in and say, this is what cyberbullying is, and have really no sense of what people use for social media or how they engage with social media or how cyberbullying takes place. And asking young people themselves to teach each other about it allows them to put the science in the context of their social experience that other people can relate to, which I really, really like it. Now, the authors go one step further, the authors of the systematic review. They say that if we were to take this and apply it to LGBTQ students, that we should include the LGBTQ students to advise and be active in selecting content, creating content, and in the implementation. So it's a peer-led, LGBTQ community-led intervention, which I think is a very clever idea. Now, Doan and colleagues created another intervention, a program called the Theory of Reasoned Action, which they used to measure the effectiveness of a video-based intervention with students. This wasn't focused on LGBT youth, but ultimately what they tried to do was to teach people about cyberbullying in a way that was sort of student-friendly, and that could foster empathy towards people who experience it. And what they found was that with increased awareness and increased empathy, that those kind of programs are more effective as a consequence. The other intervention that they focus on here is around community building, that creating LGBTQ friendly spaces online in this instance, where people can learn about identities, can learn about cyberbullying, can gather information, and can even potentially report without being outed themselves, might be an effective way for people to intervene. Now, of course, we've talked a number of times about the importance of bystander intervention. I have to say that these authors describe youth who intervene not as bystanders, but as upstanders. And I think that is so, so valuable. They found that Flanagan, Bloomfield, and Cooper were using techniques to basically try to get people to intervene when they witness or become aware of cyberbullying, and that is quite an effective method of getting people to intervene. But I love the idea of turning bystanders into upstanders. Sounds like a really a good way to frame that intervention. Now, the authors also talk about, interestingly, about parent-focused interventions and a collaborative approach to cyberbullying. So connecting with parents, teaching parents about modern technology usage and social media usage, what to look out for in cyberbullying, how to respond sensitively, and inviting parents to discuss, share with each other, to share information about technology use and about cyberbullying, so that they, can upstand themselves if they see something happening, and can intervene. They found that parents, generally speaking, don't feel very competent with the technology that their children use, and they believe that their children are experts, and that does put them in a position where children can easily step into spaces they shouldn't be, or engage in something that's like where they get cyberbullied more easily, and it's hard for parents to understand what's going on or to be able to intervene as a consequence. And sharing information, psychoeducation at home is really valuable, and that parents and teachers and school being, hand in glove, working together to deliver messages of safety to children, to encourage children, young people to disclose, and to reassure them about how people will respond if they do disclose, if there is an LGBTQ specific bullying instance at play, can be really, really valuable. And finally, they talk about school-based interventions. So they say, not only do we need psychoeducation for young people, helping young people to create spaces where they're safe, helping young people to be able to report what's happening, helping young people to understand, to recognize what's happening when it does, that they don't feel alone, and helping young people to educate each other about cyberbullying and become upstanders rather than bystanders when they see it, and helping parents to understand this stuff. We also need to make sure that schools are places where people feel safe. Fundamentally, they need to have a supportive and safe school environment where LGBTQ students in school feel safe. We've already talked about a bunch of ways that people can do that. I personally love the gay-straight alliances that have been created in Australia, found their way to the UK and the US. Really very cool intervention designed to create literal safe spaces that can then shape broadly kind of both school policy and school culture. But these authors also talk about clear school policy, not only in terms of what is considered cyberbullying and therefore not acceptable, but also what will happen to people who engage in cyberbullying. To have a very clear policy of what you will do if it's reported, how you will respond, and how you will enforce those policies in practice. And then you need to do those things, enforce those policies to ensure that cyberbullying does not take place. This is clearly critical, right? Because if this broad field of research has taught us anything, it is that cyberbullying has significant effects on people's emotional well-being. It is a very significant risk for people hurting themselves. So we really need to be having very clear policies about what is not okay and what we will do if people report cyberbullying, how we will investigate, how we will respond, and then we very much need to be able to enforce those in practice. To punctuate that point, GWASP in 2012 found that sexual minority students were significantly less likely to be bullied in schools that responded quickly to homophobic bullying than in schools that did not respond to those incidents. That's a direct quote from the authors. Gotta love it. The last major point that these authors highlight, I know we focused heavily on this systematic review, but I do love a systematic review, and the recommendations they make are so well informed by their review that we can't help but draw them forward. I hope you find them useful. The last point they make is that reporting should have an anonymous reporting option. So if we're relying on young people coming forward and telling us about their experiences rather than having an anonymous reporting system, it can make it more difficult for people to report it. And so we need a system that permits people to report what's going on in a way that helps us to identify what's happening without them revealing themselves necessarily to us. Because, LGBTQ people, apart from anything else, must out themselves to do that, right? But also, if they don't feel trusting, if they don't feel like they're going to be believed, if they fear they might be blamed, or if they fear you're not going to respond well enough, or if they fear you're going to make it worse, then all of those fears are a bit less significant if they can do so and report anonymously. Now, overall, what this research highlights, the broad research, seems to suggest that if we can create schools that are fully inclusive spaces where we understand and acknowledge and appreciate, fully include LGBTQ people in school, then school staff will become increasingly comfortable talking about LGBTQ issues, as much as any issue where people are marginalized or minoritized in school, right? Any aspect of people's identity issue is the wrong word, but LGBTQ experiences and people, if they can talk to those experiences, if they can understand them, if they are inclusive of them, then children and young people are going to feel safer in school. And that in and of itself is really, really valuable protective factor against cyberbullying as much as any other kind of bullying. And it helps children and young people to come forward and tell people when something is going wrong, when they don't feel safe. To the people posting about Imane Khalif, please be upstanders, not just bystanders. If you see it happen and you see people using language and doing something that you think would feel harmful to the person receiving it, please, keep yourself safe, but intervene if you can and if you feel able to. Upstand, because that's what we need to do ultimately, is to upstand and to create online spaces where more people feel safe. Now, to Mumsnet, to Mumsnet, my sweet Mumsnet listeners out there who don't like what I'm doing, that's okay. It's all right that you don't like it and don't agree with it. I know that you might feel unsafe yourself, or like what I'm doing makes the world a little less safe for your children and young people. That's clearly not my intent, but I respect your view, and I respect that you might not necessarily agree with what I'm doing or even with who I am as a person in the world. But I'm not going to stop. I'm going to continue to do this work because I want to create a world where more children and young people, where more gender diverse adults realize that there is a world in which they can exist. There is a world where they can find community. There's a world where they can belong. And I invite you to join me, because if you take a listen to the rest of the podcast, y'all, the podcast is not a podcast where we are judging anyone. It is not a podcast where we are trying to do harm, or it is a podcast where we are trying to bring people together. And if you turned your attention to these young people, if we work together, I think you and I can both be upstanding. We can disagree, but we can all agree that the cyberbullying of LGBTQ people is not okay. And we can come together to be upstanding together and create an online world where everyone can find a place to belong. Thanks so very much for joining me. Y'all are very, very welcome here. It is wonderful to see you as always. You'll find me now on Blue Sky. I'm at Classroom Psych on Blue Sky. I'm also still on X because I'm a sucker for punishment. And also you'll find me on EpNet. and you'll find me at the University of Southampton. Please do get in touch. If you have any questions or you want me to kind of focus on any particular prompts, if you hear anybody say some things that you are curious about, then please don't hesitate to send them my way. Or hey, even if you just have some positive messages to give, because I can sure hear them right now. It's wonderful to see you. You are exceptionally, exceptionally welcome here. And I look forward to seeing you, as always, in the next one.